everybody, and welcome to the inaugural session of the Tokyo International University Global Dialogue. The Global Dialogue is a new speaker series that we set up in conjunction with Professor Sojin Shin and Professor Jeffrey O'Daniel, who are acting alongside myself as co-conveners for this series. We are grateful for the support of our Dean, Professor Miyashita, and also grateful for the support of the university for this effort. The aim of this new series is to present new and innovative research in international relations to a wider audience. This afternoon, I am delighted to welcome our very own Professor Nathan Munier. Professor Munier will present his new book, The Political Economy of the Kimberley Process, which was published by Cambridge University Press. And discussant remarks will be provided by our very own Professor Sojin Shin, who also published a book recently with Cambridge University Press in 2018 entitled The State, Society, and Foreign Capital in India. Now, so as to make sure we have ample time to take your questions, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Munier. Thank you and welcome.
Great, thanks. And thanks to everybody for coming to my presentation today about my recently released book, The Political Economy of the Kimberley Process. So to start out, the Kimberley Process, what is it? This is a general outline I will have of this presentation. I will explain responses to it, contribution of this research, my central research question, research design and methods, hypotheses. I will look specifically at the case of Zimbabwe, which I plan on possibly building on for my next book project, and I'll discuss some of my findings. Okay, so some of you have probably seen the movie Blood Diamond, a major movie that came out in the mid-2000s. In the 1990s, many non-governmental organizations and the global community in general started to be aware of a series of conflicts in Africa in which diamonds seemed to be a major source of funding, especially in Angola and Sierra Leone specifically. The Kimberley Process came about as, or at least allegedly came about as a response to this in 2003, with the ambitious project of essentially certifying the global diamond trade, making sure that every diamond was certified that it wasn't coming from a conflict area. Now there are probably about 85 participant countries of the Kimberley Process, all of the European Union. And while many countries aren't members of the Kimberley Process, about 98% of the global diamond trade takes place between members of the process, either importers or exporters. So if you want to trade diamonds on the global market, it is pretty much essential to be a member of the Kimberley Process over time. And actually, and I always find this interesting, but now the largest importer of diamonds in the world is actually China, because about 80% of global diamonds are used for industrial instruments, and there's a big demand for that in China, and also more and more for jewelry as well. Okay, so my contribution with this research is past research on this international agreement, mostly focused on the role of non-governmental organizations in getting the Kimberley Process started, or global governance, kind of a constructivist framework to look at this. There was one previous book on the Kimberley Process. There's maybe about 10 or so other papers. Most past studies, though, on international agreements generally compare multiple international agreements and state responses to them over time. My goal of the study was to look at state-level variation to a single regime. At least initially, this was my goal. In time, what I found really interesting with this project was the state-level variation, how states, even since 2003, have in many cases really changed their responses to this international agreement. And the study also demonstrates how private economic actors can influence state-level decision-making in response to international agreements, and in turn can really shape the ultimate trajectory of these agreements. So my central research question, I think, is rather simple. Why do some states have higher levels of compliance and cooperation with the Kimberley process than others? So compliance is simply that all diamonds that originate in a certain country's territory or that cross the border need to be accompanied with a Kimberley process certificate. You can see here to the right, this is the one that the United States printed. And states themselves are responsible, as part of joining the agreement, to make their own certificates. So every state has a certificate that might look a little different. And then cooperation. Cooperation is a necessary but not necessarily a sufficient condition for compliance with the Kimberley process. Since the Kimberley process deals with the cross-border trade of a good, cooperation is inherently necessary. Although some states cooperate but are still unable to comply. And we can kind of talk about why this is later. But technology, review missions, border controls, inspectors, all these things align with the importance of cooperation with this agreement. So this was my original research design. And you can see here, I set up these 4 countries across this chart according to whether they complied or cooperated. When I was initially doing my research design, this is essentially how I set it up. What I found, though, that I think is equally, if maybe not more interesting, is that some of these countries really vary over time in their responses, or even sort of changed within these categories, or maybe even changed categories over time, except for maybe Namibia. Their response to the Kimberley process has been pretty stable. Also, Namibia is probably the most stable state I looked at too, though, so there's probably kind of a connection there. And Zimbabwe is probably the one that varied the most, which hopefully I'll be able to talk a little bit about today. Okay, so I did some field research in Namibia and Zimbabwe, especially in Namibia. I did a lot of text analysis of a wide variety of different reports. The Kimberley process prints a lot of reports, lots of government documents, newspapers, so on and so forth. Okay, on to my hypotheses. So my first hypothesis is about domestic diamond dependence. And this is from the dependency school of thought and the idea of political survival. The idea that leaders above all else want to stay in office. And that kind of precludes maybe the ideological predispositions they might have, which I think is a really kind of important theory when looking at a lot of these post-conflict states that I look at in this study. So essentially, my first hypothesis is this. The higher the level of government dependence on the private diamond industry, the more states will be inclined to accept the preferences of private economic actors that relate to compliance and cooperation with the Kimberley process. The second is interrelated, and it borrows from neoclassical economics, or simply the idea that a major arena in the competition for market share is the regulatory arena. And that's true with domestic regulatory policy, but as I show in this book, is also true with international regulatory policy as well. And then I also use a concept on power from Susan Strange. So this hypothesis is, given the level of diamond dependence in a state, the higher the level of influence over the domestic political decision-making process, held by private economic actors who have preferences for complying and cooperating with the Kimberley process. The higher the level of state compliance and cooperation with the Kimberley process. My third hypothesis, though, essentially argues that those first two hypotheses are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient to provide a high level of compliance with the Kimberley process. Some states, especially some of the weaker states I looked at in this study, have very difficult political geographies. So here I draw on a managerial school in international regime theory that essentially argues that most states want to comply with international agreements, but the problem can sometimes be one of administrative capacity. And I think that that's relevant here, being that a lot of the states I look at here just lack administrative capacity. And then the resource and Civil War literature that has largely found that alluvial diamond mining is more connected to conflict. So alluvial diamond mining, what is it? When one can just find diamonds on the surface or on a riverbed, and it doesn't really take any capital investment to mine for diamonds, usually this is called alluvial diamond mining, and that's what I look at in this study. All the cases I look at are cases of alluvial diamonds, because that's kind of more what has been associated with different governance challenges, conflict in the past, but also I think compliance with the Kimberley process as well. The other major type is kimberlite diamond mining, in which diamonds are located well underneath the Earth's surface. So this takes a lot of capital investment. It takes a lot of just regime stability, probably. A lot of times people ask, like, why I don't look at, say, Botswana or South Africa in this study. And while I do study diamond mining in these countries, I didn't think they're appropriate cases for this study, because all of Botswana's diamonds are located well underneath the ground, and most of South Africa's. So it's kind of easy to see why compliance with the Kimberley process would just be inherently easier for them. Okay, so geographical distribution matters. States where diamonds are located far away from the power center in the country, this can cause a lot of problems with compliance or cooperation. Yeah, and I especially found this, as we'll see, to be the case with Zimbabwe, I believe. Okay, so to kind of show what this looks like in a specific case, I'm going to discuss Zimbabwe. This case varied a lot since 2003, and I think I might look at this further for my next book project, you know, maybe with different variables, but still some of the same topics. Okay, just a little bit of background on the politics of Zimbabwe. Probably a lot of you have heard of Robert Mugabe. He came to power in 1980. In 1987, he consolidated power within his single party. Although there's been a lot of factions within the ZANU-PF party that have competed for power over time, and that's really kind of shaped diamond sector policy in a lot of ways. The major rival or opposition party is the MDC, but by and large, the MDC has generally been out of power except for a brief period, and has generally not had much influence over the diamond trade. So actually factions within ZANU-PF competing for dominance have shaped the diamond trade far more than the contestation between ZANU-PF and the MDC. Although a lot of times the global media seems to focus more on the latter, which is interesting. Okay. So I have a puzzle here I essentially believe would exist with Zimbabwe, and Mugabe's government and ZANU-PF in general has been notorious for ignoring many international agreements and many international regimes. But ultimately, they did spend a lot of resources and at least went through the motions to comply with the Kimberley Process. So why during Mugabe's reign that lasted up until, what, 2.5 years ago or so, why did he care about this one international agreement but generally tended to disregard most others? I think I have an answer for this. So Zimbabwe's had 5 different arrangements in the diamond sector policy since 2003. To some degree, their policy in the diamond sector has been kind of chaotic. Up until 2006, Zimbabwe was an initial member of the Kimberley Process, but not that much diamond mining went on. Some, but not that much. In 2006, the biggest diamond find in the last 100 years or so took place in the Munier region of Zimbabwe. And at the time, initially, the government set up a government-run monopsony in which the government was the only legal buyer. And this lasted from about 2006 to 2008. But since the government was very poor at the time, they could not offer anything near market value. So most diamonds during this period were smuggled around the government, but still often with people or factions of the ruling party profiting from them. The military took over the diamond fields directly in 2008, and this caused a big controversy for the Kimberley Process. Joint ventures took place from 2011 to 2016 with a wide range of private companies, and then government nationalization took place, or some sort of process like this took place in 2016. Okay, so the Munier region is in eastern Zimbabwe. It's a rather large region. It became kind of globally famous in 2008 during the election cycle when the military took over the area directly, and allegedly 2,000 miners died as government troops tried to clear the area and mine diamonds directly. This became the biggest crisis for the Kimberley Process. Like many international agreements that Zimbabwe has been a member of, this and was very controversial during this period. This kind of shook the Kimberley Process to its core in some ways. Okay, so initially, diamond wealth until 2006 didn't matter so much, except that one of the major factions of ZANU-PF, the Majuro faction, controlled most of the trade. And you can see here in the middle, this is Solomon Majuro and his wife, the former Vice President Joyce Majuro here. This faction has really kind of fallen off in terms of influence in Zimbabwean politics now, with the other faction leader, Emmerson Mnangagwa, now being the president. But for a long time, they sort of jockeyed with Mnangagwa's faction, and Majuro's faction competed heavily for influence. And to a large degree, Mugabe would kind of play these factions off against each other to a large degree. Okay. So initially, when a lot of diamonds were found, the government encouraged small-scale mining. But being unable to pay a competitive price, large-scale smuggling take place. And different factions of ZANU-PF were able to co-opt this. Almost no compliance and cooperation with the Kimberley Process during this time. Then in 2008, Mugabe made this famous statement that only the government will mine diamonds. The Zimbabwean military took over the field directly. Mnangagwa, his faction here, he's the current president, benefited directly from this takeover. The Kimberley Process stepped in and briefly banned diamonds from Zimbabwe. Actually, the Majuro faction also had their diamonds banned during this period. So this, I think, is an example of sort of using the rules of an international agreement to sort of selectively uh, move against like a factional opponent to some degree. Okay, and then with kind of the failure of the military mining diamonds, it wasn't really an efficient process at all. The Zimbabwean state moved to comply with the Kimberley Process more. And ultimately, they agreed to a joint work plan along with other countries in the region that have generally been friendly to the Zimbabwean government, like South Africa and Namibia. In 2011, all bans were lifted. Some non-governmental organizations that were really influential in the Kimberley Process left the Kimberley Process, basically arguing that if the agreement can't do anything about human rights abuses in this case, it's sort of a useless agreement. But the government was then able to sign a series of new agreements with a series of private companies, especially some Chinese companies. And they cooperate a lot with Namibia and South Africa, which I think is rather interesting, that Namibia and South Africa would sort of be concerned so much with this issue. But if the global diamond trade runs into trouble because Zimbabwe's diamonds are tainted, this could pass to Namibia and South Africa too. And that could be a problem for them. Okay, so in 2016, the diamond trade was again nationalized. Mugabe was removed by the military about 2 or 3 years ago. Mnangagwa won a controversial election. So ultimately his faction won out. Right now, the diamond sector is kind of hard to even realize what's going on, I think, to some degree. There's definitely plans to allow private companies back in, but it's kind of up in the air what will happen with this. A lot of questions about compliance with the Kimberley Process remain. The Zimbabwean-Mozambique border is long and not very well guarded. It's easy to smuggle diamonds across, essentially. There seem to be a lot of smugglers who are tied to government factions. It's simply a large area of easily mined diamonds in a very weak state. You know, Zimbabwe is a very weak state, probably outside the capital city, and diamonds are found far from the capital city. Private companies are small, often kind of largely unknown or even kind of secretive about their dealings. So one kind of really has to dig to find information about them. Private companies can also be involved in smuggling. In other case studies in my book, I also interestingly find this as well. De Beers and African Consolidated Resources actually still contain to claim diamonds in Morange. In fact, there's a bunch of diamonds like sitting at a bank somewhere in Harare waiting for Zimbabwean courts to rule on whether De Beers can like have them back or not. So Zimbabwe's future. Diamond wealth will be a game changer. Control of resources will be a constant factor in what happens in the future. Okay, this is a little long, but I think I'll just read it out loud because I think this kind of sums up largely what I found with Zimbabwe. I kind of like this paragraph. My findings about the Kimberley Process in Zimbabwe could be portrayed as the Kimberley Process being above all else a political tool for powerful political actors to justify policy preferences that they would have had anyway. This is partially true, but also simplistic, as this research shows that the Kimberley Process has also shaped the policies readily available to decision makers, thus changing their calculations and the feasibility of certain policies in the diamond trade. Okay, so in my study, just to kind of briefly touch on this, I also looked at a wide range of other cases with a wide range of other responses to the Kimberley Process. In Angola, initially, they were sort of indifferent toward the Kimberley Process, but then as De Beers started to gain more and more market share within the country, the state started to care more. The Central African Republic has had a hard time complying at all. since it's essentially been in civil war since the Kimberley process started, but I think it's an important case to look at nonetheless. And it also kind of brings up the question of, to what extent should certifying diamonds really be a priority in a environment like the Central African Republic that doesn't have a stable government. Namibia has long had a government that's been very intertwined with De Beers, and compliance with the Kimberley process in turn has been at a pretty high level. Sierra Leone, on the other hand, is a very weak post-conflict state without a which traditionally has had a relationship with De Beers but doesn't anymore. Thus, to some degree, compliance remains low there. I can maybe talk about some of these cases more in the Q&A if people have questions. Okay. To some degree, I think one could say that the Kimberley process is the public provision of a private good. It has been a way for an international agreement to push policy preferences on states that powerful private actors would have had anyway. Especially, with kind of some of the unique aspects of the global diamond trade, the fact that De Beers held a virtual monopoly over the global diamond trade till about 2000. Stopping smuggling, stopping diamonds from being traded outside of De Beers' control was long a preference it had. And the Kimberley process became a unique way to get these preferences reflected in an international agreement. And while De Beers doesn't dominate the global diamond trade like it once does, it still holds a dominant position over most of Southern Africa. And as I talk about my case studies, the Kimberley process has been a convenient tool, especially, let's say, Namibia or Angola, for De Beers to use regulatory policy to its advantage in the competition for market share in these countries. Compliance with an international agreement has winners and losers. Some companies that have preferences closer to the Kimberley process win out more. Smaller companies where any price of compliance is more difficult to play or to pay tend to lose out. International agreements tend to lock in preferences, and that is what the Kimberley process has done here. For some states, Kimberley process regulations don't really seem very well suited to the nature of the political situation in certain countries, but nonetheless, it's an international agreement that all these states have to abide by anyway, or at least pretend to follow. In some cases, especially with weaker states I look at here, private economic actors may have more influence over state-level policy than governments themselves do. And as power changes among state actors and private actors, so can state responses to international agreements. Okay, briefly, I would just like to talk about some of my areas of future research. We can also probably touch on this a little bit more in the Q&A. Okay, I think I have maybe a minute or two left. So I've been looking at diamond beneficiation. Most diamonds in, say, Southern Africa are ultimately beneficiated elsewhere. So that's something I've kind of long looked at in terms of the diamond sector. I've also looked at some other countries. I got a paper on gold mining in Eritrea. I've recently started a project on the cocoa sector in Ghana. I visited Ghana for the first time. I'm interested in some comparative politics topics. I got a paper on party systems and democratization in Southern Africa. I think that the nature of sort of the one-party state in South Africa is interesting and could be an interesting area for future research, especially given some of the recent events in some Southern African countries. And then my next book project, which I've kind of started to work on somewhat, is I want to look more at Zimbabwe. There's no book-length project yet on the big diamond find that happened in 2006 there. So I want to look more at how diamond wealth has shaped the institutional development of Zimbabwe, especially since 2006, by and large. I want to see how diamonds have influenced state structure. There's a lot of literature, quite a bit of literature on how oil booms or oil wealth has shaped state development, but not as much on other non-fuel minerals or on other resources. But diamonds in a lot of Southern African states are maybe as influential on the development of these states' institutional structures as oil is on many oil wealthy states, I think. So I think that this could be an interesting area of future research. And I think given just kind of a lot of the interest in a lot of the recent events in Zimbabwe, this could be an interesting thing to look at. Okay.
Thank you very much for that presentation, that fascinating presentation, Professor Munier, on the critical question of compliance in international relations. I would now like to hand over the floor to our discussant, who is also a colleague at Tokyo International University, and who has also recently published a book with Cambridge University Press, Professor Sojin Shin, and her book was entitled The State, Society, and Foreign Capital in India. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lamon and Professor Munier, for inviting me as a discussant to this exciting book launch. First, I want to congratulate Nate on your first book publication with the prestigious Cambridge University Press. This is a great achievement. Well, I had the privilege of reading your entire book manuscript before publication, as I was asked to write a blurb for your book cover. And I'm using the book blurb for my meeting background today, as you can see. Well, I enjoyed reading your theoretical discussion and 5 case studies and learned a lot, especially about the domestic politics of African countries between the state and the private sector. And I want to talk about the 3 points at large today. 1, diamond, its nature that makes the state control difficult. And 2, Kimberley Process as an institution. And 3, case studies and fieldwork. And then maybe we can have more time to hear your insight on my comments and questions. First, diamond, its nature that makes the state control difficult. I want to talk about the nature of diamond itself as a peculiar natural resource, which makes the state control very difficult from the beginning of the production process. How do diamonds differ from other natural resources? Well, one of the distinguishing features of a diamond is that it is a raw material, but at the same time, it can be a consumer good in which the added value can be created at any level of the production process. It means that the diamond can be traded at any time by any actor, from an individual miner to a big firm who participates in the production process. So this nature makes smuggling easy, and it further makes the state difficult to regulate the diamond market. Unless the government itself involves the process of production and trade from A to Z, well, it will be very difficult for the state to hold a dominant position to direct compliance or cooperation for the Kimberley process. So this is regardless of the private firm's preference on the policy choice toward the Kimberley process. Thus, I think that such nature of diamonds unlike that of other natural resources, such as oil and gas, well, you partially talk about it for your future research, but this enhances the position of the private sector, like De Beers, at the negotiation table with the government from the very beginning of the policy implementation process. So my idea is probably talking very well to your first hypothesis, I think, but maybe gold could be a good example to compare with the diamonds in this sense. So how do gold mining and gold trading private firms structure their policy preference? Well, however, I understand that there is no international gold regulatory regime across the globe like the Kimberley Process. So this is just my comment. Moving on to my second point, which is about the Kimberley Process as an institution. Well, you already discussed many problems of Kimberley Process in your book. The Kimberley Process is a weak regime which does not equip any mechanism like sanctions, which can force the member countries for the compliance. However, the Kimberley Process as an institution, well, international regulatory regime, has survived for the past 2 decades without much change. Why? Well, this explains the institutional stability or stickiness to some extent in a historical institutionalist concept. Well, while being implemented in many countries, the Kimberley Process has shown almost no shift of context and effects. So this led me to a couple of important questions. One, why do you think that the Kimberley Process has not changed much, despite the several critical and negative aspects in it? And second, what was the role of the predominant private firm like De Beers in the diamond market in such institutional outcome of Kimberley Process? It will be very interesting to see how different actors like the member countries, working group and committees, or civil society groups and the international communities have involved the origin and the evolution of the institutional change of Kimberley Process. And lastly, case studies and field work. Well, I truly enjoyed learning all 5 case studies you examined, and I was more interested in learning the cases of Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone, the weak states in particular, in how the 2 weak states have presented the different levels of compliance. And as a comparative political scientist, having conducted the multiple instances of fieldwork, well, I have a particular sympathy for the weak states. The weak states usually challenge me not only as an academic subject, but also as a tough field workplace that gives me good and bad memories for a long time. Well, I want to know what kinds of difficulties you encountered during your field work in such weak states in Africa, and also in which states you felt the biggest difficulties in handling your field work. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for those insightful comments, Professor Shin. Professor Munier, you may go ahead and respond. And in the meantime, people, the audience can begin to think of questions.
Great, thanks. Yes, thanks a lot for these questions. So I would say with the first, diamonds are often thought of as, say, having kind of unique properties to a large degree. There's sort of no other resource that you could carry around like $1 million worth in one's pocket or something like this. It's sort of notoriously easy to smuggle across borders. A lot of times in the Civil War literature, diamonds are referred to as the ultimate loot for rebel groups, as being particularly easy to trade. I think gold has probably some similar properties too, but as you were saying, there is no global certification scheme for gold, although some people have proposed this. There's really interesting literature though about fair trade certification for gold. But ultimately, these fair trade certification schemes in terms of gold really just mean traceability, or that the buyer knows where the gold originated at, kind of like what the gold of the Kimberley process says. So a lot of the literature on certification schemes in terms of gold say that fair trade is kind of misleading to some degree with this. You also kind of have similar dynamics with, say, coltan or other types of resources as well. I think also too, I think something you said that was really insightful here is that the unique nature of diamonds and the ability to smuggle them easily also does, I think, but the private companies at a unique bargaining point with states, because private companies can smuggle diamonds too, and to some degree they might be able to tell certain states that if they don't like the regulatory environment, they can just smuggle some of the diamonds out of the country, or they can maybe get certain pay off certain people within the government to look another way, or certainly in some of the cases I look at, things like this happen. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, to look at is sort of the bargaining power between states and private diamond companies, and what gives them the ability to get a more favorable deal or less favorable deal, or something like this. Some deals with private diamond companies have been kind of notoriously unfavorable for the state. Like, let's say, for instance, De Beers in South Africa would probably be an example, where they paid very low taxes, for the last 100 years or something. Okay. Another really interesting thing is the Kimberley process is an institution. Why hasn't it changed much? I think the answer for this is simply too many veto players. Any one state essentially can veto policy. So kind of like how I talk about in the book, other international agreements that have had so many veto players, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, it's just really slow to do anything in a sense, because any state can undo any policy, and thus the policies that were locked in 2003, the way of thinking about conflict diamonds that they decided upon in 2003 has persisted, even though it doesn't maybe make as much sense in some of these contexts I look at in my book. But no actor maybe wants to undo that either. But yeah, I think this kind of trajectory of the institution and sort of the path the institution has taken is a very interesting one. And then finally, the field work. I think the most difficult thing about it is just getting to Southern Africa, because it can be kind of far and expensive too. But once you get there, it's rather cheap. And actually, I would encourage people to visit countries in Southern Africa. They're, by and large, very nice countries to visit, especially, let's say, Namibia. They have everything there. Caves, dunes, beaches, nice cities. Very interesting place to go to. Also, I'd say another difficult thing too is it's often hard to talk to private diamond companies as an academic. In fact, I've kind of found it to be telling in a sense that a few times I've tried to talk to private diamond companies in some of the states I study, and they tell me to go talk to people in the Ministry of Mines. So that kind of shows how kind of intertwined private companies and the state are, I think, in some cases as well. Okay.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you for your replies.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that. So I'll go ahead and turn to the audience. We have one audience question from Nadia, who asks, I have a question about the successes and failures of the Kimberley process. Could you explain what are the successes and failures of the process?
Well, Yeah, I think there's some people who, even in the world of NGOs, which have generally been really critical of the Kimberley process. There's some non-governmental organizations or civil society actors that would just say the existence of the Kimberley process is better than not existing. So I think you get a lot of arguments along that line, in a sense. They might know that it can't be reformed. They might know the kind of past trajectory it's taken is not really achieved as much as most would like, but nonetheless, its existence um, shows cooperation on a difficult issue by a lot of states, and is better than if it didn't exist. And maybe to some degree, there's something to be said about that. Within Zimbabwean non-governmental organizations and civil society, there's sort of a big debate about this. Some have this belief that, okay, it's a flawed process, but it's allowed for local groups in Zimbabwe to, point at the government and say, you're not doing what you're supposed to, in a way that maybe they wouldn't be able to if the Kimberley process didn't exist at all. Also, outside of, let's say, Central African Republic and the Ivory Coast, and probably Democratic Republic of Congo, diamonds contributing to conflict is not the issue it once was. It probably in the 1990s with Angola and Sierra Leone. A lot of that probably has to do with kind of the unique nature of those specific conflicts, and the unique access the rebel groups had to diamonds in those countries. But some would say that, at that time, maybe about 10 to 20% of global diamond trade came from conflict areas, according to a lot of estimates. Now, most estimates would say maybe 2 to 5% or something. So some people would, I think, point to that as being progress.
Thank you. I think we have another question from the audience. Duong Trong Long has his hand up.
Sure.
Yeah, hello. I'm Lung. I'm a student from TIU, and I would like to ask that. So, thank you for enlightening me on the Beers company. I only knew them as a entity who dealt with customers, but I didn't think they would play on like the level of states and governments too. And with that, I want to ask that. Let's say we bring the Beers company out of the equation. Let's say we cut out the middleman and we have the African states, sell to clients directly. Would you say that that would increase the stability of these states, and would it be a net positive for these states to do so, or would it just further drive them into chaos and disarray?
Yeah, in theory, I suppose, but especially in some southern African states that have a lot of diamonds, specifically Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, the foothold of De Beers in those states is really heavy. It's kind of hard to envision a scenario in which De Beers is going to leave anytime soon or something. Actually, De Beers has been selling off some of its mines, especially in South Africa, but it sells its mines off to other companies that are friendly or that have similar sort of preferences to them just in general. Especially Petra Diamonds would be an example. So, while De Beers' dominance over the global diamond trade has really dropped off since 2000 from kind of a virtual monopoly of the global legal diamond trade at one point, it still really holds a heavy position in the diamond sector, and it really holds a heavy position over some countries, and it's kind of hard to see that going away. And kind of just expand on that, I think one of the reasons why De Beers gave up sort of the price fixing it had done for a long time, the global diamond trade, at around 2000, was that price fixing also came with a lot of costs. To dominate the global diamond trade, they had to continue to buy up the global diamond trade, and more that became just impossible in a sense. But it's still kind of hard to view any economic sector in the world, a major economic sector that is dominated by one country to the extent that De Beers is. And especially, let's say, in Botswana and Namibia, there are really close ties between the government and the state. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that that question and response. The next question we have from Edwin. So again, addressing the issue of private companies, based on your findings in those states, was it the state or the private companies that had more leverage when it comes to vetoing change? And in the case of Zimbabwe, what was the trigger that all the veto players coalesced to, or was the trigger that allowed all the veto players to coalesce to a change, knowing that the arrangement changed 5 times in around 2 decades?
Good. Yeah, I think this is a great question. It depends on the case. I think Zimbabwe is a really interesting case because if we look at Zimbabwe in general, in terms of negotiating with private diamond companies, the state has clearly had the upper hand, by and large, and that's different than most other states, more or less. In fact, Zimbabwe essentially kicked out De Beers in 2006. It's really hard to envision any other state in the region doing that. So Zimbabwe is kind of developed in sort of a unique way in many cases. In, say, Namibia, Angola, I think it's pretty clear that private companies have had the upper hand by and large. Although in Angola, there's been 2 major companies, De Beers and also the Level View group, that have competed really heavily there. And then this Level of View group has also tried to get into Namibia in various periods as well. And De Beers has kind of been able to use Kimberley Process regulations to go after the Level of View group. And interestingly enough, even in a state like Botswana, where this other large diamond company hasn't ever made inroads, Botswana's been sort of able to use kind of the idea that they might talk to Level of View about a future deal as bargaining power with De Beers. So you sort of see that dynamic as well.
Thank you. And next we have Lee, who asks, can you talk about some significant development in the economy of African countries after the enactment of the Kimberley Process, especially in terms of the lives of miners?
Oh, this is a really good point. I think a lot of people have this belief that the Kimberley Process should do something about mining regulations, but narrowly, the Kimberley Process is really just dealing with conflict diamonds. And initially, they defined conflict diamonds as being the use of diamonds by a rebel group to overthrow a legitimate government, and that's it. So ultimately, it doesn't have much ability as an institution to do anything about issues like abuse of miners or child labor or exploitation of miners. So I think this is why a lot of people have sort of seen this agreement as not going far enough. But a lot of proponents of the Kimberley Process, or a lot of states that are part of it, will say that it's a security agreement. It's not really a human rights agreement. I think some people expect it to maybe be that. I think some non-governmental organizations would have wanted to see it sort of grow into that. But because of sort of the nature of the institution, it hasn't really taken on those issues at all. Yeah.
Great. And next we have a question from Professor Akitoshi Miyashita.
Hi.
Hello.
Nate, congratulations on your book publication. I was looking at the Amazon Japan to purchase your book. It's currently not in stock in Amazon Japan, so it takes a while. But I will definitely get a copy and ask you for a signature. You know, I read your chapters when at the job talk, and now I hear your talk, and this project has been very interesting, because it tells a lot about international institutions, norms, domestic political economy, Um, and I just have one question about the De Beer, the role of De Beer. You mentioned something like, De Beer's dominance in diamond trade has declined over the years, although the company still has maintained a significant grip of the, the market. I just wonder why this, De Beer's influence or the dominance has declined over the years, and who are the new rising players in this diamond trade? And finally, what are the implications? Does the decline of the influence of De Beer mean the weakening of the Kimberley process, or does this say anything about the political economy of some of the diamond producing countries? I just want to hear your opinion about these questions.
Yeah, I think some of it was that a lot of diamonds were found in Russia. So Olarosa, this large Russian company, now has a lot of the global diamond trade. There's a lot in Canada now too, where De Beers doesn't have much of a foothold. So this was a big challenge. Also, it's just kind of some of the political situation in states like Sierra Leone and Angola became more and more difficult for De Beers to stay in those countries or to stay as dominant in those countries as they were. And I think ultimately it may have just kind of been an economic calculation that they would just have to pay too much to kind of price fix at the point they once did. The major diamond company that has challenged De Beers kind of in De Beers' central area in Southern Africa is Levieu and his kind of group of different diamond companies. He's one of the wealthier people in the world, multi-billionaire, and he got a real foothold in Angola. During the Civil War, he signed an agreement with the MPLA government to have an essential monopoly over the legal diamond trade there. And he's been able to stay in Angola ever since, although De Beers came back in 2006, and there's a lot of competition there. I think some of it too is that De Beers has pursued a strategy where its main goal is to just hold on to a lot of its really big mines in, say, Botswana and South Africa too, where it will continue to have a big influence. Interestingly enough, though, more competition in the global diamond trade has, I think, changed how states view have viewed their agreements with De Beers. And while it seems like De Beers will stay in these countries for a long time, it might not necessarily seen as inevitable as it once did. It will also be interesting to see if De Beers tries to enter into Zimbabwe again, because that's also a lot of diamonds outside of De Beers' control as well, and that's also probably kind of hurt De Beers' ability to dominate the global trade. Although it's kind of hard to tell during some periods exactly how many diamonds are being produced in some of these countries.
Thank you for that. We still have a few more questions to get to. The next question is from Win, who wants to know a little bit more about how your findings fit into broader studies of economics in Africa.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think it shows how international agreements can have kind of a clear economic element to them. And I think here I showed that in this case, with this international agreement, really what has mattered in terms of how the Kimberley process has actually played out has been the domestic economic environment in a lot of cases, more or less. I think it also sort of illustrates how in a lot of African countries, private companies hold a lot of influence. Let's take, for instance, Namibia. They have a long history with De Beers, and a lot of scholars of Namibia say that, the modern Namibian state and De Beers are very intertwined to a large extent. So I think it sort of highlights that to a large degree.
The next question is from Win Yen Thu, who asks that since conflict diamonds are narrowly defined, this has left a major loophole. And since it doesn't prevent Zimbabwe from committing abuses when it sells diamonds, with such a huge loophole, will the Kimberley process be revised in the future?
Probably. I mean, my guess would kind of be probably not. I think to some degree the Kimberley process can be viewed as back in 2003, or in that period when the Kimberley process was first decided on, De Beers held a dominant position in the global diamond trade, and it still does. But I think De Beers, they knew that they were going to lose influence, but the Kimberley process allowed them to keep a lot of the policies or regulatory policies that they always wanted in an international agreement that would be locked in even after they would maybe lose a lot of their market power. It's a little bit like how we see in international agreements a lot of times. States might sign on to an international agreement knowing that their successors might not go along with it, but it's still going to be harder for them to get out of the international agreement than if the state wasn't a party to it already. And I think we see this dynamic pretty heavily here. I think there's a lot of major actors who are heavily influenced by De Beers that are not going to want to change it that much. And it's interesting too with the Kimberley process because a lot of states that don't have much, power globally, like Namibia or Botswana, actually have a lot of influence in the Kimberley process or have served as presidents. So I think, how sort of this decision-making or how this institution has worked, it's worked differently than other international agreements. And I think some of this largely has to do with sort of the distribution of power in the diamond trade when this agreement was first decided upon.
And related to the topic of compliance, Nishala is asking, why do certain actors oppose the process and not comply with it? What do they lose by agreeing to it or gain by opposing it?
Yeah, that's kind of a good question. In theory, it doesn't really cost that much to sign on with it. Actually, in my case study, the Kimberley process, for instance, or in the Kimberley process in the Central African Republic, there was a series of coups there, and every new coup leader was pretty much signing on to the Kimberley process right away. Well, it was kind of a cheap way to sort of signal to the international community that they wanted to abide by its rules without maybe really having to change policy that much, right? So I think we sort of see that. And let's say for Zimbabwe, initially, until they found a bunch of diamonds in 2006, the price of pretending to comply or signing on to the Kimberley process would have probably been rather minimal to a large degree. Some states, though, are really worried about their reputation, especially more diamond-dependent states. And I think that that's a real driver with spending their resources on the Kimberley process, especially in the late 1990s when it looked like there might be a boycott on diamonds or something like this. A lot of major government leaders were really concerned with how this could really hurt a lot of diamond-dependent countries. In fact, even Nelson Mandela was really involved in the creation of the Kimberley process because it probably would have hurt South Africa quite a bit if diamond prices would have dropped too much. So I think that has sort of driven a lot of states' heavy participation within the process.
And the next question comes from Andre, who notes that there is still an illegal diamond trade, and even though diamonds are being traded illegally or kind of are illicitly traded, they still provide the country with national income. So they still provide kind of some sort of financial benefit to those involved in the trade. Do you think the Kimberley process is effective against this type of illicit diamond mining and trading? And also, what would you change with the certification scheme?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing to bring up. One problem I think the Kimberley process has is, let's say if diamonds are smuggled across the border, but then reported and taxed in another state, studies show that people in that state don't really care that much, or don't really think it should be any sort of priority to stop that process. So, a lot of diamonds will cross borders and then be certified in a state different than how they originated because, prices are higher there, simply. And as long as they're being taxed, a lot of times governments don't really have a lot of incentive to do anything about this, nor do, even civil society groups care that much or something like this. So, I think there's kind of an inherent problem built within it. What to do about the Kimberley process? I say in my book, I think the Kimberley process brings up kind of a lot of issues, especially in some of the weaker states I look at. I don't know if it's really very well suited to deal with, a post-conflict country like Sierra Leone that just kind of lacks basic infrastructure. It might make more sense just to deal with these sort of problems first and deal maybe with diamond certification later, in a sense. People might not necessarily like the illegal trade in diamonds, but I don't know if it should necessarily take priority over many other problems that one could argue are more urgent in a lot of cases.
And the next question comes from Barry, who notes that the Kimberley process exists to help block diamonds from war-torn and conflict-ridden areas from being sold. But he asks, will the process also help us allow to trace the origin of these conflict diamonds as well? And if so, can the Kimberley process help in terms of UN intervention and serve as the basis for humanitarian intervention and other principles such as R2P, or the responsibility to protect?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up. It doesn't really, it's supposed to trace the origin of all diamonds that cross borders. But what often happens is they will cross and then be reported somewhere else, and it's kind of hard to tell with this. I'm glad you brought up the United Nations because it's interesting. The United Nations actually, in the case of Ivory Coast, where diamonds around 2005 were contributing to conflict, was able to push sanctions on the Ivory Coast, and the Kimberley process wasn't. And I think that the reason for that is the Kimberley process has like 80 veto players, and ultimately the United Nations has 5. So the United Nations kind of saved the Kimberley process from a crisis there by essentially preempting it, by banning these diamonds before the Kimberley process could deal with the issue. Now, I don't think that the United Nations could have dealt probably with the Zimbabwe case, though. I think even the Security Council probably would have been split on that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And our next question comes from the audience, and we have Edwin.
Right. Am I
Hello.
audible? Right. Hi, Professor. My question is actually like kind of like a question that asks like, does the egg come first or the chicken come first? So basically the question is the Kimberley process shapes the state preference to adhere to international regime, or is it the state preference that created the Kimberley process? Or like, how would that mechanism work out based on your research? Thank you.
I think I kind of see it like this. I think if we look at De Beers' preferences over a long period of time, it always tried to influence the domestic politics of states to get regulatory concessions. In fact, in some cases, this was De Beers pressuring states to allow its own private security to stop diamond smuggling or something along this line, especially, let's say, in the case of Sierra Leone or Angola. So I think what sort of happened is a lot of people, a lot of non-governmental organizations or groups in civil society were bringing up this issue of conflict diamonds in the late 1990s, and a series of reports came out, so on and so forth. And I think De Beers started to realize that this was a useful way to get a lot of his preferences reflected on an international level. It's kind of hard to see the Kimberley process working without the largest diamond company at the time going along with it, and without a lot of major states going along with it. And I think kind of the unique nature of the diamond trade and the dominance of large companies is why the Kimberley process exists, and there is nothing like it for gold or for coltan or oil or any other type of resource, where there's also, you know, issues about these resources contributing to conflict. Yeah, I think it's kind of the unique nature of De Beers specifically. And I think without De Beers, we wouldn't see it, or we wouldn't see it in the form that it's taken ultimately.
And what will be our last question from the audience will be a question from Yen, who asks, how much can NGOs impact on the process of decision-making when compared to the role of the governments and diamond industry?
You know, this is interesting because a lot of prior studies that look at the Kimberley process talk a lot about non-governmental organizations. In fact, the one previous book on it talked basically all about this. Pretty good book. I think it's pretty interesting. I don't really think, though, that as we see the Kimberley process play out ultimately in different states, I don't necessarily think non-governmental organizations have mattered that much. At times they've been agenda setters. At times they were able to gain maybe some influence by writing reports that were critical of the Kimberley process, so on and so forth. But even when a lot of non-governmental organizations protested with allowing Zimbabwe back in 2011, and a lot even left the Kimberley process, they weren't able really to change the ability for the Kimberley process to do anything. Non-governmental organizations can participate within the Kimberley process, but they're not veto players. So I think how the institution's actually played out and how it's played out in specific states, the influence of non-governmental organizations is maybe important in the sense of getting people to think about certain things, or maybe being agenda setters, or being able to sort of shape the discourse in some ways on some of these issues. But in terms of actually like setting policy or getting states to do what they wouldn't otherwise want to do, I think it's been rare when they've been able to do this.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Munier. And once again, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to congratulate you on the publication of your new book, The Political Economy of the Kimberley Process. And I would definitely recommend that everybody take a look at that. There's a lot of really interesting findings and research and field work that can be found in the pages of that book. I'd also like to thank everybody for attending this afternoon. And I'd like to draw your attention to the second event in our Tokyo International University Global Dialogue Series, which will be happening next month in October. That will include Professors David Shim from the University of Groningen, and also Professor Seiko Mimaki from the Takasaki City University of Economics. And the two of them will be discussing the Statue of Peace and the politics surrounding that particular statue. Also, keep an eye out for future events. We have another event coming up in November that will focus on exploring and reflecting upon the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And to stay informed about our future events, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at IR@Tokyo International University. Thank you all so much for coming out and listening to this presentation today, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon in the near future. Thank you.